Good morning, everyone. For those of you in Australia, good morning. For those of you in Latin America, buenas tardes, boas tardes. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. My name is Noel Campbell. I'm the Director of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies, ANCLAS, and we've convened the panel discussion today to share experiences arising from the growing trend for governments to politicise migration and refugee policy. At the outset, let me convey my appreciation to a number of colleagues from the ANU College of Law, from the Centre for Migration Policy in Washington, DC, and the Migration Policy Centre in Santiago de Chile. They've been very helpful in setting up today's event, and it's been very much a joint effort. But let me begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands the university operates, and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, past, present and emergent, whose ancestors have protected and nurtured these lands for tens of thousands of years. I should mention at this point that the webinar will be recorded and eventually made public on the website. In terms of format, the program will consist of two main parts. First, a couple of introductory presentations. Professor John Minns from the ANU College of Arts and Social Sciences will speak about how the politicisation of migration and refugee policy has been manifested globally and here in Australia. And Andrew Selly, the president of the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, will comment on how governments in Latin America have attempted to address this issue. The second segment will be a panel discussion moderated by myself and my colleague Eve Lester, in which John and Andrew will be joined by two other experts, Juan Pablo Ramachiotti, the Executive Director of the Centre for Migration Policy in Santiago de Chile, and Kate Ogg, the Associate Professor of the College of Law here at the Australian National University. And this segment will be an opportunity for panellists to compare and to contrast global and regional experiences, and more particularly those of Australia and Chile. Before passing the floor to the first speaker, however, let me give the subject a little bit of context. I originally thought that a good starting point would be to get a sense of how many people we're talking about. That is to say, what percentage of the world's population, for whatever reason, live outside their countries of origin. But that was a mistake, because estimates of the numbers vary immensely. Definitions of who those people are vary immensely, and perceptions vary immensely. So I thought perhaps a better starting point is to accept the reality that certain governments have indeed politicised refugee and immigration policy, to acknowledge that the issue is complex and highly contentious, and to recognise that its salience can be quite different from one country to another, and in some cases within a country. That said, it's a phenomenon that has certainly got some common characteristics as well. It usually involves tapping into existing fears and concerns about national security, for instance, concerns about cultural identity, about economic competition, and about the capacity to provide services. It can also play on nationalist sentiments by emphasising the need to preserve cultural identity and national values. And it manifests itself most obviously when it's used as a tool during election campaigns. Increasingly, we've seen politicians advocating for stricter immigration policies or promising to limit refugee admissions as a way to appeal to a particular voter base. Another common thread is the range of negative impacts of the politicisation of refugee and immigration policy. It can have significant humanitarian implications, for example. When governments prioritise political considerations over the protection of vulnerable individuals, it can lead to hardship and abuse. It can also raise concerns about the commitment of those governments to international human rights norms and the rule of law. Disagreement over immigration and refugee policy can also put strain on bilateral and regional and multilateral relationships, and in that way affect efforts to address collectively common challenges. And it can overshadow the positive contribution that migrants and refugees can make to their host countries by filling labour gaps and by contributing to economic growth. But I wonder how the very general observations that I've just made translate in practice in Australia, Latin America, and globally. For that, let me turn firstly then to Emeritus Professor John Minns and subsequently to Andrew Selly. John Minns' background is uniquely relevant to today's discussion. His research is focused on the political economy of development, especially in Latin America. He's also been closely involved in refugee politics and is currently a member of the Refugee Action Committee here in Canberra. He's going to provide a brief overview of the issue as it has played out in Australia and globally. So, John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Noel, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on this question, which is, as you said, not just of academic interest to me, but as an activist, something that I've been passionately involved in for a very long time. I want to attempt to do three things in this brief introduction. The first is to give an overview of the refugee issue globally, or in many countries at least, and the ways in which it's been politicised, largely by formations on the political right of centre, but not entirely. In some cases in the centre or even the centre left. Secondly, what I want to do is to look at the ways in which I think historically it's become such a fraught political issue, so central in politics in many countries, in the world. And to do that, I want to look at the example that I know best, which is Australia, why it's become such an issue in Australia for now at least 2 decades. And thirdly, what I want to do is to look at the ways in which I think it remains an issue, the ways in which political formations that attempt to exploit the issue, generally by adopting very harsh refugee policies to get political advantage, why that succeeds, or why it continues to succeed to the extent that it does. So let's start, shall we? Australia. There are a number of election campaigns since 2001 in particular, in which the refugee issue has been an important issue. 2 of them in particular, the issue has been exploited by the Liberal National Party, the conservative side of politics in Australia, in 2001 and 2013 successfully. In both cases, the issue was raised by them as a major question of the security of Australia's borders, with slogans like "Stop the Boats" and so on. In 2010, it was also raised as a major issue, but they weren't successful at that election. But the idea that in Australia, a refugee issue which doesn't affect really the daily lives of the vast majority of the Australian people should become such a politicised issue and a major issue in election campaigns is something that's got to be explained. Why is it that things which have far more relevance to the daily lives of ordinary Australians could actually become even secondary in some cases to the refugee issue? But it's not just Australia. In Britain, currently at the moment, the Conservative Party is attempting to emulate some elements of Australia's very harsh policies, including offshore detention, and has begun, well, it's concluded negotiations with Rwanda, which will be Britain's equivalent of Manus Island and Nauru as offshore detention centres. So far, they've been held up in doing it, but clearly they are using the refugee issue, people crossing the channel into the UK, as a major political issue for them in the lead up to the next election. Poland. Poland is one of the number of countries in the EU which, since the refugee influx of 2015-2016, has refused to take any refugees at all, and has made the refugee issue a major one. Kaczynski, the leader of the Law and Justice Party, the ruling party in Poland, says that Poland would be changed forever if mainly Muslim refugees were allowed into it. He actually poses it as an existential threat, not just a threat to security or threat to jobs, threat to the economy, but as an existential threat to Polish culture, which would be wiped out if these refugees were allowed in. The same, and that's a not very subtle Polish magazine that says Islam is raping Europe, the headline there, and again, not very subtle, with sort of dark brown hands molesting this very Polish, European-looking woman. So it's been a major issue in Poland and in keeping that party in power. The same thing in Hungary, where Viktor Orban last year won a fourth successive term in government, very largely on the basis, in 4 elections now, very largely on the basis of keeping refugees out, particularly Muslim refugees out, who he says are not Muslim refugees, but Muslim invaders. And there are even further right-wing parties in Hungary which exploit the issue as well. In Sweden, again last year, a formation called the Sweden Democrats had an astounding 20.54% vote, which makes them the second largest party after the Swedish Social Democrats. Amazing rise, and a large part of it, so they're on the far right of politics. Their origins are actually in pretty openly Nazi party formations in the 1970s and the 1980s. They're not in government, but they're necessary to keep the government in government at the moment, and their policy is zero asylum seekers. And the Swedish government is moving towards that kind of policy. In Italy, again last year, Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy came to power, 26% of the vote, and again, very far right-wing origins for the Brothers of Italy. In fact, in the formation that was formed after the Second World War, the MSI, of which she was a youth activist for a period, and again, she's called for a naval blockade to keep refugees out of Italy and out of Europe altogether. In Germany, those are all parties in government or supporting government. But there are major political formations as well, which have arisen, particularly since 2015, 2016, such as the Alternative for Germany, which in 2017 became the 3rd largest party in the Reichstag with 93 members of parliament. And it's the first time that a party way out on the far right of politics has had seats in the German parliament. And its key part of its policy is to keep Muslim refugees out of Germany. For groups another group, of course, that's not in power, but very important in terms of campaigning on this question, Marine Le Pen, the former National Front, now Rassemblement organisation, has made a major question now of Muslim refugees in particular. She didn't win the presidential election last year, but she got 42% of the vote. So very significant. Now we look at all of these formations, these governments and political organisations that are not in government, and they disagree about most things. Some of them are market-oriented neoliberals, some are statists, some are pro-globalisation, some are anti-globalisation. Some are anti-feminist, some are anti-gay, some are not. The one thing that they agree on is about non-European immigration, and in particular Muslim refugees. It's the single thing uniting the far right and the centre right in government in Europe, and to a certain extent social democratic parties as well. In Denmark, which has historically had a fairly tolerant, liberal attitude to refugees, the current government, the social democratic government led by Mette Frederiksen, has adopted, again, a very harsh policy towards refugees, and has also begun negotiations with Rwanda to send the refugees there. And in the United States, in 2018, the issue of people crossing the southern border into the United States and the building of the wall that Trump wanted actually led to a 35-day, the longest ever, shutdown of the US government over appropriations for that wall. And as you can see from this graph, the proportion of people who mention immigration as the most important problem, and it's not immigration from Europe that they're talking about, or from Canada, it's immigration across the southern border in particular, has risen quite dramatically. So let's ask the question, how do we get there? How do we get to this point where it's become such an issue? I want to talk about Australia here, and I think the crucial period to look at is actually the 1980s, because in the 80s, a number of things come together in this country, and I think there are similarities with other countries on this question as well. The first is that the post-war boom is decisively over by the 1980s. We've had a recession in the mid-1970s, but then major recession in the early 1980s, which then gets worse in the early 1990s. This is the unemployment rate. So people are feeling much more precarious by the 1980s. Their jobs are much less secure. But it's not just that. Let me get all of these up. Oops. Other things are changing, which make people feel insecure. So technological change starts to be applied in a way that starts to displace workers from many industries that previously have been secure. So the first ATMs, automatic teller machines, introduced in 1981, barcodes at checkouts, jobs that you needed to, jobs behind counters, for example, begin to be displaced in that period. There is a much greater level of outsourcing, contracting out, which makes in-house employment much less secure as well. There is a casualisation of the workforce. If you see this graph here, I can't actually use the laser pointer here, but the casualisation of the workforce climbs quite dramatically, or secure workforce declines quite dramatically, particularly in this period in the 1980s. Government policy also puts people in a more precarious situation. So tariff protection for a number of industries declines quite dramatically, as you see there, and a number of industries simply go to the wall in Australia in that period, industries like textiles and some manufacturing and so on. And a broader set of neoliberal policies start to pull away some aspects of the social safety network that had been there in the past, including, for example, free higher education, which disappears at the end of the 1980s. This economic precarity, if you like, that starts to be keenly felt by the 1980s is paralleled by major demographic and cultural changes that take place. Up until 1966, Australia still formally had an immigration policy called the White Australia Policy, a racially discriminatory policy. It wasn't really gotten rid of until the early 1970s, in fact. But then what we start to see is a demographic change in Australia that makes many people feel uncomfortable and feel insecure. So here, for example, is on the left, a street in a Sydney suburb called Cabramatta in the 1960s at the top, and Cabramatta High School, photograph there, virtually all white. And this is a more recent photo of the same street and kids from the same school, very much changed. And many people feel this keenly, and it opens up a political space for political opportunists who might try to join the two sources of insecurity and feelings of precarity. And that space does open up in the 1980s with people like Geoffrey Blaney, who talks then, who writes a book, All for Australia, talks about the Asianisation of Australia and how the crimson thread of kinship with Britain is being cut by Asian immigration in particular, and a well-known publisher, Ida Buttrose, still well-known, just retiring as the chair of the ABC at the moment, also dipped into this debate saying that Australia was being changed from a European-based Christian society. And the then leader of the federal opposition, one John Howard, later, of course, to become Prime Minister, now dipped his toe in that water in 1988 and said that perhaps if people thought the pace of Asian immigration was too high, perhaps it should be slowed down. In other words, what he's saying is to reimpose a racially discriminatory immigration program. Now, he might have got some popular support for that, but the reaction from business was extremely hostile. There were polls actually done at the time with business leaders to ask them what they thought of this, and they hated it. And they hated it for two obvious reasons. One, that what he was doing was undermining an immigration program which contributed to about half of Australia's economic growth, and still does. At the moment, I heard in the news this morning, actually, that we are probably in a per capita recession at the moment. The thing that's keeping us out of recession is a high level of immigration. But generally, it's been about half of GDP growth. So by saying this, and we weren't going to get that kind of immigration from Europe, it had to come from places like Asia. He was undermining that. Business hated it. The second thing that he was undermining was the orientation which, from the late 1960s, certainly through the 70s, Australian business had taken towards Asia. So now our four largest trading partners are all in Asia. In the 1960s, by 1965, our largest trading partner by far was the UK. Now it's tiny. So you could hardly have business leaders doing deals with Asian leaders, Asian business people, and at the same time having an immigration policy which discriminated against them. So business hated it, and I've been through that. Howard actually lost the leadership for that reason, in part. And despite the fact that he took that policy to the 1988 election, I think what happened is that political leaders learned a lesson out of this. You couldn't attack an immigration program in general. You couldn't try to get populist support on that basis in a country like Australia. You couldn't attack Asian immigration in particular. They learned that lesson. Then in 1992, just over a couple of hundred of Cambodian refugees appeared in boats, very small number, and the then Labor government changed its policy dramatically and instituted a policy of mandatory detention. That is, they locked them up. Initially for a limit of 273 days, and then a year later with no limit. So it became indefinite mandatory detention. What was the reaction from business? Nothing. Business didn't care about the refugee policies because the refugees and the numbers that they were coming were economically insignificant. And the places they were coming from, and increasingly through the 90s, it's from places like Afghanistan and the Middle East, were not major trading partners anyway. So it became clear that it was possible in Australia to play the issue of refugees and therefore to draw on some of those sources of discontent, insecurity, precarity that people had been feeling, and to use that, to weaponize that politically without consequences from business. Why does it work? I think it continues to work. One, because refugees have become something of a symbol for, in particular, non-European immigration in general, because they're very visible. If you arrive at an airport with a visa, so what? But if you arrive like this on the shores of Italy or Greece or Australia, it is a very visible sign. And these tend to be people of colour, and most recently, of course, is Muslims. Secondly, you can shift the perception of fear from one group to another. When Pauline Hanson, far-right Australian politician, made a maiden speech in 1996, she said that Australia was being swamped by Asians. When she came back into Parliament in 2016, her first speech said we were being swamped by Muslims. The perception of threat can have different targets, but you can still weaponize it politically. And thirdly, there's the reality of the numbers of people arriving and the perception of that as threat. So, for example, in Europe after 2015, 2016, I've been through some of the political changes that have weaponized the refugee issue from the right in particular, but actually the numbers of people coming, living in Europe from outside Europe is quite small, only about 10%. And half of those are from another country in the European Union. Compare that with Australia, where about 28% of people are born overseas. And estimates, this is a really interesting political science. When you look at the numbers of people who think, the numbers of Muslims people think live in the country, they generally overestimate it by at least 3 times. And when they look into the future, they tend to overestimate it even more, by about 6 times. So the perception of threat is much greater than even the reality, even if it was a threat, which I don't think it would be. So in Europe, for example, there were about 1 million people arrived in 2015 and about 400,000 in 2016. That represents about 0.2% of what was then the EU 28 population. Compare that to migration in Australia, it's about 0.7%. That is about 2.5 times higher on a per capita basis. And in fact, places like Italy require far more than those numbers every year to maintain their population. Declining population very rapidly, not just Italy. Third, so in Poland, for example, where the issue of Islam is huge, less than 0.1% of the population is actually Muslim. And yet Poland is probably one of the most hostile places to having Muslims enter. Why does it work? Partly it's a question of dog whistling. One of the things that happened in the 1960s is that the left won on some of the really big cultural questions, and one of them was racism. At least you couldn't overtly be racist. You couldn't say that non-white people were inferior or shouldn't be allowed into the country because they weren't white. But what happens then is that some of those sentiments are driven underground. So without overt expression of that, you can have nevertheless very hostile, racist or xenophobic sentiments which are expressed in other ways. So if you ask people in Australia in 2019 who has a negative attitude to Muslim immigration, the numbers grow up very significantly when they do it anonymously compared to when they do it speaking to an interviewer. In other words, they know they shouldn't think that, but they do. And so politicians can play on that, and dog whistling works actually better than being openly racist on the question, because being openly racist forces people to confront their own racism. And they know they shouldn't be. Dog whistling works. And finally, and this is where I end up, it works politically because the polarisation on the issue is not symmetrical. That is, the people who are hostile to, say, Muslim refugees are very hostile. The people who don't worry about it and aren't hostile just think it's not an issue. And so they're not politically active around it. They tend not to be voting on that question. So what we get is that parties and political formations, not just in Australia, which campaign against, say, Muslim refugees, tend to strike a chord with an audience immediately. The parties that are not in favour of harsh measures against them don't as easily find a large base of support. Anyway, I think I've got a little over time, so I hope that provides a basis for some discussion. Thanks.
Many thanks, John. I think you've put out there a number of points that provoke us to think. I think the biggest takeaway from me is the change in perception. You mentioned originally there was apprehension about demographic change in Australia, but that was countered by the private sector saying there are economic advantages in this. Then you referred to the distinction between the perception of Asian immigration, which has now become acceptable, and refugees. And finally, I think you talked about the perception years later, not of negative views of Asian migration, but rather of Muslim migration. So I think one of the things that we need to be conscious of is that it can be a changing ballpark, and perceptions can be disguised and can be dealt with through time or through economic development as well. But listen, let me now invite Andrew Seeley, the president of the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, DC, to comment on some of the issues that have been raised already from the perspective of Latin American countries. Prior to taking up his present role, Andrew worked for several years with the Woodrow Wilson Center Latin American program, where he founded the center's Mexico Institute. So Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you, ANU. It's a pleasure to be in Australia. I wish I were actually with you. I hope to be in Australia in the beginning of December. So this is my first stepping a foot in Australia this year, even though it's virtual, and great to be able to join the conversation. Latin America is a bit different. Latin America did not have a lot of migration within the region until recently. These were primarily countries. Now there's a history of immigration. I mean, starting actually with the arrival of what we today would call indigenous people from Asia, thousands of years ago, perhaps 20,000 years ago. Obviously, a period of arrivals from Europe, slavery, and then voluntary arrivals of people from Europe and Asia and the Middle East and all over to Latin America. But in recent years, in the 20th century, most of the 20th century, Latin American countries were countries of emigration. Some countries had very little immigration or emigration, but those that had lots of international mobility, it was probably primarily emigration to other parts of the world. And clearly that was true of Mexico and Central America to the United States, but it was also true of countries like Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia, to Spain, and sometimes to Italy, and to the United States and Canada, the Caribbean, to Canada, or to former colonial powers in Europe and to the United States. So most countries thought of themselves as emigration societies, or simply as stable societies that might have a history of immigration, particularly in the Southern Cone. This started to change about 12 years ago, around 2010. So let's say the last decade plus, there has been an enormous amount of international mobility within Latin America, as well as a lot of transit migration within Latin America of people headed to the United States. And that's different from before, because people who came from a long distance were traveling through other countries, generally were not visible before. Right now you have large numbers of people transiting through multiple countries, often in large groups, and very visibly so. And so countries that might in fact have been transit countries, Costa Rica, Mexico, parts of Central America, Colombia even, now are very visibly transit countries. But let me start with the first story, which is the first story is you have in that 12-year period almost a doubling of the number of people, foreign-born people in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's a fairly large number in a 12-year period. Some of this is driven by economic opportunity. A lot of regions within Latin America, sub-regions in Latin America and the Caribbean, had entered into mobility arrangements. Mercosur is the best known one, where people could move freely among the different countries and actually lived as temporary migrants for up to a couple of years, even stay permanently in most cases. The Caribbean had mobility, at least among professionals. The Andean countries have mobility without work permits until recently, and now they actually have in the last couple of years also some ability to move and stay. And 4 countries of Central America did. There had been this attempt at a time where there wasn't much migration within the region. Most of the migration was outside the region, for neighboring countries to think about how they could create regional blocks that started off as being often trade blocks, but eventually incorporated notions of mobility. Some of that continues, and people, particularly in neighboring countries, often move to each other's country. People live in border areas or move near neighboring countries, and that's continuing. It's probably increased. The biggest difference, however, has been a series of displacement crises. The first and biggest being the Venezuelan crisis, where you have almost a quarter of the population of Venezuela leaving over the past decade, both because of political conflict and because of an economic meltdown that has rarely been seen in the modern world at this level. Venezuela was one of the most middle-class societies in Latin America, and today is among the most impoverished. And people left because they couldn't get healthcare for their kids, or because they had participated in a protest march and were told that they were to lose their jobs or they might be killed. There was a variety of reasons, or they simply realized that the income that they had made before that sustained a middle-class life, now or lower middle-class life, barely gave them enough to feed their children. And so you have about a quarter of the population, about 7.5 million Venezuelans left. And most of them have stayed, despite the stories you hear about, hotels in New York, most of them have stayed in Latin America. About 6.5 million are somewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean today. Largest number in Colombia, 2.8 to 2.9 million, latest numbers. About 1.5 million in Peru, 500,000 in Ecuador, 500,000 in Chile. I know Juan Pablo will talk about that later. And then large numbers in Brazil, in Argentina, in Costa Rica, Panama, Mexico, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Dominican Republic, Curacao, Aruba, many other countries. I mean, there's no country in Latin America that has not received a fairly large number of Venezuelans over the past 10 years. That's transformative. And people came often in very precarious situations, often with quite high human capital. Venezuela was a very educated country, but who were arriving in quite impoverished circumstances and trying to start their lives over. We also saw a huge outflow of people from Haiti. After the earthquake in 2010, you see Haitians have long gone to the Dominican Republic and the Bahamas and other places, but an intensified number going to those places, as well as to Chile, Brazil, Ecuador, Mexico, and other countries in the region. Nicaragua, after the crackdown in 2018 on political dissent, you see a huge outflow of about 200,000 Nicaraguans to Costa Rica. And that may seem like a very small number compared to 6.5 million Venezuelans in Latin America, except that 200,000 Nicaraguans in Costa Rica is about 2% of Nicaragua's population and about 2% of Costa Rica's population. So it's quite a significant change in a very short period, about a 3-year period of time. And then you see other movements, Cubans on their way as the economy gets much worse. You also see Central Americans from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, heading north to Mexico and occasionally south to Costa Rica, sometimes trying to get to the United States and staying in Mexico, sometimes simply as transit migrants. And then what we've seen in the past 2 or 3 years is increasing numbers headed to the United States again. I mean, the story of 2010 to sort of 2020 was really a story of migration within the region. But what we're now seeing is a large number of people also headed to the United States, particularly as the US economy heats up and as the labor market in the US grows older. And those things actually sort of coincide at the end of COVID. You see an actual shift, which was a long time coming, in which the US labor market growth is almost entirely driven by the foreign-born. At the same time, the US economy rebounds very quickly from the COVID economic crisis, the global recession, and you begin to see, a huge demand for labor in the United States, and it's recovering much quicker than most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So large numbers of people headed northward, many of them the same Venezuelans also, who have gone to other countries now thinking that they could be better off if they headed north. If we had had this conversation 3 years ago, I would have said the story was primarily about pragmatism. And in fact, we had written this sort of, the creative responses of Latin American countries. I would say, compared to conflicts you've seen elsewhere in the world, the response to large, to really vastly increased mobility in Latin America and the Caribbean has been comparatively mild. There has been an attempt in most countries to try and create some sort of legal status, at least temporary legal status for people who've arrived, or to make existing visas more accessible, in a handful of cases to use the refugee system. That generally speaking, there's been what we've called sort of betting on legality, which is sort of an attempt to try and give people, if they're going to arrive anyway, some sort of legal status in the country, give them access to education. That's true of all countries, but Trinidad and Tobago, to some extent Aruba and Curacao, but generally speaking, kids everywhere have access to education. And surprisingly extensive, Juan Pablo may talk about this in Chile, but lots of countries have really gone out of their way to extend even healthcare services. I mean, certainly basic healthcare, but even other forms of healthcare, even to those who don't yet have documents or don't have documents. We think there's about 2/3 of the people, of the Venezuelans who've moved, largest group, have gotten some sort of legal status. It could be a little more, it could be a little less, or in the process of getting. That's a lot. Tells you about a third have nothing, right? So, better than other responses perhaps to displacement crises in other parts of the world, and yet deeply imperfect. What we are seeing, though, in the past few years is that Latin America is starting to have some of the same negative reactions to increase in migration that we've seen elsewhere in the world. It has been mostly less strident in Latin American countries. I would still say there's a greater degree of solidarity and pragmatism. It's very interesting in Latin America. I mean, much of the world, it has been the far right that has been critical of migration. Because so much of the displacement in Latin America happened as a result of what was a self-declared, socialist government in Venezuela. One could doubt whether they are socialist, but certainly self-declared socialist government, a self-declared socialist government in Nicaragua. Governments of the center-right have often actually been quite sympathetic and have actually seen sort of the enemy of my enemy as my friend. And so have actually been, and that's actually neutralized some of what might have been a more polarized atmosphere. And you've seen some countries. I mean, Colombia went from having very few migrants, about 0.2% of its population 10 years ago were foreign born, to having about 5% of its population foreign born, about 3 million Venezuelans. You actually had a pact in the last two elections of all the political parties in Colombia agreeing not to use migration as a political issue. This is quite extraordinary in many ways. Now, that belies the fact that underneath this, there is a current now of cansancio, of tiredness, with the arrival of migrants and displaced people. You do see bubbling up, particularly at a local level, of reactions, very negative reactions, and including moments of some lynchings and riots against migrants in particular cases. Not perhaps as pronounced in some other parts of the world, but you start to see some political leaders in Peru, for example. I know Juan Pablo will talk about the complex situation in Chile. Peru, notably, you've seen sort of the government both legalizing, continuing to regularize people without legal status, and at the same time saying, but we're going to deport everyone who doesn't have legal status, right? It's sort of a schizophrenic reaction. On the ground, most countries actually have gone out of their way to integrate people. And at the same time, now you start to see some of the same political reactions. And I would say there's sort of three things behind this. I mean, I'd say one is, what we heard earlier, of course, is I think important, which is that, people in precarious circumstances struggle when new people arrive. And some of that's symbolic. Some of that is just a fear that you're going to lose your job in precarious economic circumstances. But as we try and remind people, sometimes it's real, right? I mean, sometimes the person who is dealing with a school that has 40 children in a classroom, and suddenly there are 5 Venezuelan kids that show up, the parent is maybe is not a racist against Venezuelans. They maybe are just really concerned about the fact that their school is overcrowded in the first place. The complaints about emergency rooms, and this is a continuum. There are people who hate those who are different from themselves. That's certainly true. Don't like demographic change. But sometimes the detonators around precariousness have to do with the fact that people already felt that they were vulnerable, and now they feel more vulnerable for very practical things. Housing prices went up. The emergency room is even more crowded than it was before, and it was already crowded, right? So things that actually can be dealt with that are tangible. Other things are more symbolic, but tangible. And so precariousness matters in this. I mean, I think there is a large undercurrent of also people worrying about rules. And I think for those of us who think that immigration is generally a good thing, we should also recognize that the perception is when people cross the border without documents, that can also be seen by many people as a violation of order, right? Now, what Latin American countries have done in many cases, particularly with displacement crises, is try and legalize that, try and find ways that people can enter legally or legalize their status once they're there. But I don't think we should be surprised that for some people, and we see this in the United States a lot, and by the way, the people who I mostly hear from on this are people who are immigrants themselves. Actually, you often say, I waited for a visa and I waited for a really long time. How can someone just walk across the border? And I don't think we should underestimate how the perception of things not following rules and people not following rules really does undermine people's confidence in the immigration system. And so some of the getting ahead of this and actually trying to create legal pathways and regularization mechanisms actually tries to take care of some of that by saying, yes, there is an order to this, right? There is a way we're actually dealing with this. or when governments have come out. So you've seen a lot in Colombia, you've seen it less so in Peru, but a lot in Colombia where you've had sort of something of a commitment at a state level in different administrations to say, this is we are welcoming people who've been displaced because of the chaos in the country next door and because of political persecution, right? And finally, I don't think we should ever underestimate that change is hard. And again, this goes from people who simply don't like people different from them to those who simply are adapting to a different reality. Now, it may help that there's more similarity in language and religion and so on among people in Latin America and the Caribbean, but never underestimate how we can find profound differences in things that might to outsiders look like minor differences. People can quibble about which arepa is better. People can quibble about, all sorts of things that they find marks of distinction, whether one is Catholic or Protestant. We've seen this all over the world. I think we're at a moment where circumstances have changed, and I will leave it here, where I think we can no longer assume in Latin America that that all is well on migration and people are adapting and it is fine. I think there's enough of an undercurrent that we see genuine preoccupation. There's some ability to get ahead of this, both by making sure people have legal status, by strengthening integration, and by really investing in some of the services that are taxed by migration. And by the way, one of the other things that, for example, there's some research now in Colombia that shows that, when Venezuelans came into the informal economy early on, the people who actually suffered economically were people in the informal economy, and particularly the poorest in the informal economy. Long term, Colombia's economy is going to do really well out of this. Chile is going to do really well. Trinidad's going to do really well. Migration is probably going to add to the human capital and add to the labor market in ways that generate economic growth. But if you talk about the first year or two with a shock of people coming to the labor market that weren't there, we should assume there are some real things that need to be dealt with, right? So how do you cushion some of that? And how do you cushion things like housing and education and healthcare, not just for migrants, but for the communities that are affected? So I think that's one thing to think about. I do think there's a whole agenda around figuring out how political leaders can continue to try and hold at bay the worst elements of our nature and continue to try and leave this out of the political conversation, and deal with it as an issue that actually has upsides and opportunities. But that is going to be easier in some political systems than others. And in the end, there's a huge need, and this is where I'll end, because there is such broad transit migration right now through Latin America for people headed to the United States. There's also a really urgent need to figure out legal pathways. Actually, the Biden administration is trying to do this in a somewhat haphazard and not always, effective way, but they seem to actually be trying to work towards it. Let's say they don't have the tools anyway, but trying to create both protection mechanisms that identify people earlier before they flee, and also legal pathways that allow people to come to the United States and work, rather than assuming that those who can make it to the border might be able to get in and do it. And see if we can do this process earlier, because also we're starting to see a reaction in some countries in Central America, big in Panama and Costa Rica and Mexico, where you're starting to see some reaction against transit migrants as well. And again, all the same things come into play in this as well. So especially the perception of that people are breaking rules and why are they coming this way? And so getting ahead of that and creating pathways that allow people to move legally and people to get in line to move legally. Not everyone can come at a given time, but at least know where you get in line would begin to create some order in that process. So I'll end there.
Many thanks, Andrew. As in the case of John, I think you put out a number of issues there that for us are not only provocative, but educative, because we in Australia sometimes imagine that these sorts of issues are our exclusive challenge. And maybe it occurs in Europe as well, because they see that on our TV screens every night. But the fact that it's an issue and an emerging issue in Latin America is something to contemplate as well. There were a couple of points from your presentation that stood out to me. One was your reference to transformative mobilization of people. That is to say, the increase in volume of people who are moving. The other point was this shift from pragmatism on the part of many Latin American countries, that is to say, to be welcoming, to willingly allow migrants access to schools and to healthcare, to a more negative reaction as the volumes are increased. I'm also pleased that we talked a little about solutions as well. You mentioned the need to rationalise legal pathways. You mentioned the need for governments to look at strengthening integration policies, the need to change the conversation from something of apprehension to the fact, and we know well here in Australia, that migration actually adds to human capital, it contributes to economic growth. Now I think is the right moment to move to the panel discussion. Yes, Ambassador.
If it is possible, because will have an appointment with Mr. King, I'd like to say something to Andrew, if it's possible now.
Okay.
Thank you. It's very brief. Dear Andrew, this is a small world. It's really nice to see you here. I'm Arturo Cabrera from Ecuador. Now I am ambassador here.
Arturo, how are you? I did not know that,
Fine.
Ambassador. Good to hear your voice. I can't see you, but I can hear your voice. So great.
Okay.
A great, I should say, a great expert on migration himself. So, you know, not only a great diplomat.
I'm very glad to see you, and haven't been to Washington or visiting the MPA in some years, but we're keeping in contact, and I want to thank you for this very interesting analysis that you have done. Just to mention maybe two things, as you know, Ecuador for many years, and this is based on numbers of the United Nations numbers, was the separating migration and refugees. Number one recipient of refugees in Latin America. Now, number of people in general has changed after the Venezuelan crisis. But this is one thing, and many people don't know it. They still ask us if we receive people from the Middle East. We do also, but it's not really, it's from the region. As refugees, and mainly from Colombia, 90-something%. The second thing I wanted to mention very briefly, and I will finish with that, is that politicizing the topic of migration doesn't work exactly the same in all places. We have seen in Ecuador that the center right or right have taken decisions that are popular. And being humanitarian is still popular in countries like Ecuador. We just naturalized, give the Ecuadorian nationality to 500,000 Venezuelans in a big process that has should have had a big impact, but politically, it's still well received by the population with a tradition of humanitarian responses. That's the only two things I want to say. Sorry, no, but it's just because we will have to leave early.
Not at all, no. And thanks for mentioning both points, because in the questions that we have in mind to ask, certainly the second point is one that we're going to put to some of the panelists. As I mentioned, it's going to be recorded, so you'll be able to see it later at your leisure. So listen, let's move now to the panel discussion. We're going to be joined here by two colleagues, Juan Pablo Ramachote from the Center for Migration Policy in Santiago de Chile, and also Kate Ogg, who is with the College of Law here at the Australian National University. So we've heard from John and now from Andrew about the increasing trend for governments to politicise immigration and refugee policy. Let's see if we can drill down onto some more specific situations and look at the case of Australia on the one hand and Chile on the other. So let me start the questioning, and then I will pass the baton, if you like, to my colleague and co-moderator, Eve Lester. But let me ask the first question to you, Juan Pablo. Can you give us a brief, and please, very brief, we have about 40 minutes left, status report, if you like, on the current situation in Chile? What has the volume of irregular arrivals been over the past few years? Where are they from? Why has it become politicised? And what's the narrative that politicians in Chile have used? Has it been different in relation to some cohorts, for example, Venezuelans, as opposed to other cohorts, for example, Haitians? So, Juan Pablo, in 3 to 5 minutes, please, can you give us a bit of a status report on the current situation in Chile?
Hello, Noel. Thank you for this invitation. Hello to the panel and the audience. Well, I could say that Chile has seen profound changes during the last years, both in migration in general to the country, and also how the perception and the political debate in the country behaves towards migration. We have today around 9% of our population composed by migrants. It's 1.7 million people, according to one of the last numbers that we had, which is an estimate. And the migration in Chile increased from 400,000 in 2014 to 1.7 million last year. So it happened in a short period of time. And today, the main collective of migrants living in Chile are Venezuelans, which are, as Andrew said, 500,000 people. And it's mostly caused by the Venezuelan crisis, so it increased in a very short period of time. And with that, irregular entries have raised. Today we have at least 200,000 people living in the country that are the official numbers that we know. We don't really know how many are today. But it's a relevant number, thinking on how much migrants are actually living in Chile. And the public opinion has gotten worse in the last few years, mostly because by social problems during COVID, because security issues where there had been migrants involved, but this is a situation that has been covered maybe in an exaggerated way by the media. And because if we see the actual numbers of crime regarding migration is proportional than crimes committed by Chileans. So there's a distortion made by the media. And also because this is maybe connected with something that John said, where the state and the government and public institutions are failing, there are commonly an issue with migration. If public health is not enough, if the market, if the job market is having problems, if education system doesn't have enough resources for the population, and that there's a short way to blame migrants for that. So, I would say that problems with perception and political debate in Chile are closely linked to that, and also because irregular migration has increased during the last years, and that has a lot to be, maybe we have time after to discuss it, with the measures that the government has taken in the last years, especially regarding the Venezuelan migration. And today, the irregular entries that we know of are an 80% confirmed by Venezuelans. So the Venezuelan crisis is closely related with political issues around migration, also with poverty issues around migration. And this will be my last comment on this. And I think that the problems about political polarization, public perception, are having a more determinant role in the public policy decisions, and especially regarding regularization decisions than what maybe we could say that are more appropriate decisions in order to integrate the Venezuelan population, and also reduce some tensions that arise from the irregular migration and migration in general. So there is a tension that is not only a problem in general terms about integration of Venezuelans and migration in general, but also regarding the decisions, the policy decisions that need to be made around these issues.
Thanks very much, Juan Pablo. Let me pass the baton, as I mentioned, now to my co-moderator, Eve Lester.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you for such fantastic contributions so far. It's really been a wonderful discussion, I think. So my question is for Andrew. And Andrew, we've obviously heard a little bit from Juan Pablo about the situation in Chile. And just thinking about the situation more broadly in Latin America, and you've talked quite a bit about that. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit further on variations from country to country, just in terms of what you see as being the tipping points for different countries. Is it about numbers? Is it about absorption capacity? Is it about the nature of the country? Is it a transit or destination country? And if I can also just throw in another question for you, which is, you talked a lot about solidarity and pragmatism, and certainly I think as an observer of responses to refugee and forced migratory movements globally, I think Latin America is quite an interesting example that we can all learn from. But you talked about solidarity and pragmatism. I wonder whether homogeneity is a factor in the way in which states respond. And I've just put in my notes former Yugoslavia, the Ukraine, and the way in which Europe responded to those crises, whether there are sort of parallels there.
I think you signal a lot of the things that are part of the variations, right? I mean, I think certainly homogeneity. That said, again, we're capable as human beings of killing each other over speaking a different dialect or being part of a different sect within the same religion. So, variation is a relative thing. But I do think that there's some cultural affinity. There's certainly a historical affinity, particularly between Venezuela and Colombia. Certainly early on, the fact that Venezuela had taken in so many Colombians was important. So many Ecuadorians had lived in Venezuela. I mean, indeed, in the last legislature, as Ambassador Cabrera could say, I mean, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, which has jurisdiction for migration, had spent much of his life living in Venezuela. So I mean, it was actually quite simple. He had returned, was part of the people who had sort of returned as things got worse, though he himself was an Ecuadorian national, right? So I mean, there are these times in Colombia, a lot of people, we say, a lot of Colombians who came back at the same time. Well, a lot of mixed families of Colombians and Venezuelans, because there were, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Colombians living in Venezuela, and lots of mixed families. And so those things certainly matter. We've seen a much different reaction with Haitians in much of the hemisphere. It's hard to believe, there aren't very many good studies on this yet, but it's hard to believe that race is not a big part of that. Language perhaps, and different histories and whatever you want, but it's hard to believe that race is not a big part of that picture as well. Certainly social status matters in education, people's response. It has helped that in the case of Venezuelans and Nicaraguans, there's a fairly large number of people who are well-educated as well. Nicaragua is not a pretty well-educated country, but a lot of leaders were, either well-educated or natural leaders who left for Costa Rica. Venezuela was a very well-educated country, so that certainly has helped. It also has meant that they've been able to sustain organizations in the countries where they've arrived. And so they've had some ability to, have some influence, migrants and refugees, to actually have a voice on the ground, especially at a local level, but even occasionally at a national level in some of the decisions. The Ecuadorian, the former assembly member of Ecuador is kind of an elite case of this, but it's happened in multiple other ways. I mean, among the Venezuelans who were displaced are always a few people who were quite wealthy as well, and people who are professionals who found their footing in the countries where they went and have been able to become the nucleus of organizations. Actually, I have to say less the wealthy Venezuelans. It has tended to be more the professionals, many of whom left for, early on, became the nucleus of a lot of the organizations. This is true in Nicaragua as well, the incredibly organized diaspora of Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. So I think those are some things. The other thing is the capacity of government to respond. Some governments, Colombia, in Ecuador, and Ambassador Correa spoke about this, that have a somewhat, if the president says go here, it tends to happen. The government functions somewhat coherently, and there's been an ability to build a common narrative and then a common follow-up in policy that happens. Certainly Costa Rica does, Mexico for the most part, Brazil certainly. Other countries, and I'm fearful that the ambassador of Peru is sitting there and is going to jump up when I say this, but the Peruvian government, for example, there were 11 ministers of the interior in the last government, last elected government, not the current one. I think there've been 3 already in this one, if I'm not mistaken, but 11. Just the churn and the turnover. So there were a lot of policies that actually had continuity. Particularly on regularization, access to education, but the political noise kept changing, right? The political discourse kept changing depending, and for presidents. So, it kept changing continuously. I think that's true in the current period as well. So there's also something about the state's ability both to, have a common narrative and to follow through with what it proposes to do. And then finally, I would say on the flip side of this, a lot of it also, the reaction has to do, yes, with race. I think that we can't underestimate race, class, ethnicity being powerful factors in how people draw otherness with others, but also the whole question of precariousness. The actual sort of, people's, a lot of these crises happened around or just before COVID. Right. And COVID was a really terrible time for a lot of people. It was an impoverishment of the lower middle class. It was disastrous for people in the informal economy. A lot of people suddenly, and so there's an equating of, what's happening to me now with the arrival of these people, whether or not it has anything to do with the arrival of these people. Right. It may be independent, but it ties into that narrative, and it ties into that moment in time. And you've seen in some countries, and Juan Pablo referenced this, the rise in crime. Noticeable in Chile, noticeable in Ecuador. It does not seem, we've actually done a study on this, and it does not seem that it is correlated anyway. In fact, overall, immigrants tend to have a lower arrest and lower incarceration rate than the native born in most countries in Latin America. But that doesn't mean that you don't have people who are immigrants who are involved in criminal activity, right? And in some cases, organized crime groups from Venezuela, which has its own organized crime groups, have moved into some of the other countries in the region. And that's a powder keg. And so I think we should also assume that's another narrative, depending how that's played out in the local texture, whether crime has gone up or it stayed stable. That's another factor that gets intertwined with this conversation as well.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Let me see if I can switch the conversation a little to talk. You mentioned capacity of governments to respond. So let's dig down on that issue a little in the case of Australia, for example. And if I can put this question to you, Kate, we all know that the issue of irregular arrivals in Australia, as John mentioned at the outset, has long been politicised. But and the narrative of different governments has been somewhat different, somewhat nuanced. But what sort of strategies have those governments in Australia, by strategies I mean legal and policy and regulatory measures, have been adopted to respond to the question of unsolicited migration or to refugee policy, and how successful have they been? Can you give us a bit of an idea of what the panorama has been here in Australia?
So the first thing I want to speak about is when we talk about legal strategies, legal responses, it's important to remember Australia is a legally pluralistic society. So, and I include myself in this, when refugee law scholars talk about laws, policy, legal responses, we're really referring to colonial law. But we have to, I think we've all got to make more effort to remember and emphasise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have been politically active in this area. I don't think, I'll speak for myself, paid enough attention to their political activism. And one example I'll give you, something I've been reading about a little bit, is Aboriginal passport ceremonies. And so these are led by Indigenous elders, and they've made a real effort to provide these Aboriginal passports to asylum seekers and refugees, even asylum seekers and refugees on Nauru and Manus Island, which is, of course, on the one hand, an assertion of sovereignty, an assertion of Indigenous sovereignty, but also an act of hospitality and welcome. So I think that's the first thing to really think about, is that we do have a colonial legal system and Indigenous legal systems, plural, and we have to think a little bit more about what has been the Indigenous legal response, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander response to what we might call unsolicited migration or asylum seeking. But turning now to colonial law and policy, so some of the strategies that we've seen, and I'll probably, I think John gave such a great expert summary of what was happening in the 80s and 90s. I'll start off really from the early 2000s, and that was a very significant moment for refugee law and policy in Australia because of the Tampa incident. So for those of you who are not familiar with that, it was a Norwegian vessel that rescued a boat that was in distress, and entirely consistently with its obligations under the law of the sea, tried to bring the people on that boat to Australia as the one of the closest countries. And our Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister John Howard, for a long time refused to have the people on that boat disembarked onto Australian territory. And from a refugee advocate's perspective, quite unfortunately, that coincided with September 11. So I think what was significant about the Tampa and refugee law and policy in Australia is that we really see refugees being portrayed as national security threats, but even more specifically as terrorists. And we still see remnants of that even today with, for example, border force, the fact that we choose to use militaristic, police-like language to refer to the organisation that regulates migration. So from 2000 onwards, some of the strategies, policies we've seen, excising parts of our territory. So Christmas Island, for example, is from a migration perspective not part of Australia. So people who come by boat can be taken there, and they are subject to a different legal system, different refugee system than people who arrive by plane, for example. We have seen, and this is I think one of the most concerning, what we call pushbacks or turnbacks. So this is on the high seas, Australia officials turning back boats of asylum seekers trying to reach Australia, and that's a really problematic from a refugee protection perspective. It's called, refugee law scholars have really labelled this as a violation of our our non-return obligations under international law. Of course, we've seen offshore processing, the development of offshore processing centres in Nauru and Manus Island. We've also seen immigration detention, and John mentioned this briefly, indefinite immigration detention. And I think quite a sad part of Australia's legal history is that there have been many court challenges to indefinite immigration detention, and those legal challenges have not been successful. I think perhaps what I'll finish off with is that what we've really seen in Australia is this dichotomy between legitimate refugees, genuine refugees, and illegitimate refugees or bogus refugees. And that I think the distinction is often drawn between those who arrive in what we say is a legitimate way. So they come through our resettlement programs, for example, and those who arrive by boat. So there's that distinction is drawn in law, in policy, and also in narrative and rhetoric. And ironically, I think under our international obligations, the Refugee Convention in particular, it is actually those people who come in an unsolicited fashion that we have that obligation to, the non-refoulement obligation and all of the other rights in the Refugee Convention. Australia's resettlement program, which Australia is posits, very proud of. We really position ourselves as a refugee protection country when we talk about our resettlement program. We're not obliged to do that under international law. I mean, I think it's wonderful that we do it, but I think there has been a misunderstanding, perhaps an intentional on part of our politicians, perhaps unintentional on parts of the Australian population. I think there's this belief, understanding that those who come in that very managed way through our resettlement program are our legitimate, genuine refugees, and those who come by boat, or those who come without a visa, are illegitimate, ungenuine, and Australia has. There's a understanding that Australia has no international obligations to them, which is not correct.
Thanks very much, Kate. Let me pass the floor again to Eve.
Thanks, Noel, and thanks, Kate. That was really useful. Can I just flag before I put a question to Juan Pablo that we do have a question in the chat from Alan Gamlin, and I think what we might do, it's a question for Andrew, but what we might do is I just wanted to acknowledge it. We hold that and come back to that in a moment. Is that how you'd like to proceed, Noel?
That would be fine, Eve. Go ahead with your question to Juan Pablo.
Okay, thanks. So Juan Pablo, so Kate's talked about the legal and policy responses that we've seen in Australia at the initiative of the Australian government. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how different Chilean governments have responded to the increase in irregular arrival, and what sort of measures have been taken? Has there been strengthening of border controls? What makes a person an irregular migrant or an irregular arrival? And I'm particularly interested in how that interacts with the regional mobility arrangements, because is there pressure at a national level to increase restrictions, notwithstanding the rather broad possibilities for mobility within the region under regional arrangements such as Mercosur?
Thank you, Eve. Well, I would say that regional agreements, for example, the Mercosur, is not a problem in political terms, because the countries that today we have the agreement with, or Chile is applying to the Mercosur agreement, are countries that are not provoking tensions regarding migration in Chile. For example, Peruvians, Bolivians, Argentinians, those are collectives that are in Chile from several years, and are not the main collectives that have increased in the recent years. For example, Colombia, which is also in the Mercosur agreement, and is a country that Chile is not applying the agreement since some years ago, and it has to be with the situation that Colombian migration to Chile increased some years ago. So I would say that's the only case, and maybe non-binding agreements or statements are a more challenging scenario. For example, the Los Angeles Declaration, and which specific measures are to be taken regarding its goals, and regarding the response of different governments, I would say that the irregular arrivals started increasing, and when the Chilean government started putting restriction to the entry of tourists, basically, because before the new Chilean law, someone who entered the country as a tourist could change its migratory category from a tourist visa to a resident visa. So Haitians and Venezuelans started migrating to Chile as tourists, and once inside the country, they would try to get another kind of visa. When the last government stopped the possibility for those collectives, and then the new law made it a general policy, and irregular entries started to rise. So, and maybe that was one initial measure to stop the flow, which reduced it significantly, but it raised the irregular entries to the country. And this government, in order to stop or to reduce the irregular entries, tried to impose two measures. The first was to put the military force in the border, and the second was to implement immediate removals at the border. And the second one has been more difficult to implement for the government, because most entries, irregular entries, are through Bolivia, and the Bolivian government hasn't agreed to receive nationals from countries different than Bolivia. So Venezuelans, for example, can be removed from Chile to Bolivia when they're entering the country regularly. The irregular entries have decreased, but we still have, for example, during the first semester of last year, we had around 30,000 irregular entries to Chile. During the first semester of this year, we had 20,000 entries. This is the official record by the border police. But from Venezuelans, for example, this year the government issued 15,000 temporary resident permits, which is very similar to the number of Venezuelans that enter the country regularly. So we still have a problem about regular paths. And I would say that the measures that this government would be willing to take are not very popular, like regularization programs, like opening more widely family reunification systems, work permits, which are considered in our current law, but how it's not clear at which length are they actually being implemented, and how many visas that are being today given by the government are for people who is already in the country, or for people who is willing to enter the country by regular paths. So I think that's the challenge.
Thanks very much, Juan Pablo. I think I'd like to switch again to look at the response internationally to policies taken by countries like Australia. And I'll address the next question, if I could, to you, John. Kate and Juan Pablo have given us a flavour of what the legal and policy changes have been in Australia and in Chile, respectively. And you also touched on this in your initial intervention. And although there are obvious differences in both cases, there are similarities too. They've both involved strengthening border security. They've both involved the imposition of stricter entry controls. I guess my question is, how have those measures been received internationally? Have they been the subject of criticism? Has it changed over the years? I'm thinking in particular of European countries who were very critical of Australian policy in the early 2000s. but seem to have adjusted their policy. I think you mentioned countries like Denmark. Looking at the Australian president, so how has the response been and how has it changed?
I think internationally, the response to Australia's policies have varied. So practically every international humanitarian organisation, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, etc., have all condemned Australia's policies and have done so consistently for many, many years. In terms of state responses, again, this is varied. So there's certainly been criticism, although states, I'd say, generally tend to stay away from criticising each other's immigration and refugee policies. But more recently, you're right, there's been an attempt to look at what various people in Europe and elsewhere have called the Australian solution, rather chilling term, I think. And in particular, the idea of offshore detention as a deterrent, and as I mentioned, the UK and now Denmark. And certainly for those not in state power, there's been, particularly on the far right in Europe, real enthusiasm for the Australian solution. So Nigel Farage, for example, who campaigned for Brexit in the UK, UKIP, etc., talks about the Australian solution. Various far-right figures in Holland, in Austria, in Sweden, and so on, have all talked. Sweden Democrats, for example, have talked openly about the Australian solution and adopting it. So it's been a varied response. I think part of the, if I could go back just one step before that question and relate it to something that Juan Pablo and Andrew and Kate have said, and that is about pathways to finding a solution, to finding refuge, is very, very important because Australia historically did provide those pathways very well. In 1976 to 83, Australia took about 90,000 Indo-Chinese refugees. Only just over 2,000 of those arrived by boat. Because very largely what Australia did was to process applications for asylum in the transit countries in particular. So in this case, it was Malaysia and Thailand, giving people incentive not to get on the final dangerous journey. And that, I think, unfortunately, I think in Europe, when you look at 2015 and 2016, it was the failure of the European Union to process applications at a sufficient rate in places like Turkey, where people had been for up to 4 years at that point, since the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2011, in refugee camps, that eventually creates the pressure cooker and causes people to come in other ways. So, I think Australia's, an Australian exporter of its refugee policy is not something that we should be proud about at all.
So, Kate, what we've heard, we've heard quite a lot from John about different national positions in Europe and so on, that were hardening, the hardening of borders and so on, and the concerns about Australia exporting its policies and practices, and particularly the UK and Denmark showing such deep and disturbing interest in that. And I just wonder if you could speak to the internet, some of the specific international human rights issues that the policy that the policies have raised. So, I mean, you've got a pretty big range of issues there, lots of human rights obligations and lots of policies. So feel free to pick, but perhaps the most significant would be the ones that are looking to spark the interest of other countries, such as detention and externalisation.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So what I am actually going to start off with, so John's already mentioned UN officials, for example, special rapporteurs have already condemned Australians, a lot of Australia's refugee law and policy. But one thing I will add to that, and I think this is quite significant, especially with respect to what we call, policy transfer, the idea that countries such as the UK are picking up on Australia's externalisation policy. So that's, for example, boat turnbacks, offshore processing. A number of times complaints referrals have been made to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Now, in a lot of instances, it has been Australian actors involved in these complaints, so Andrew Wilkie, for example, but some of the actors involved are not from Australia. Some of them are, actors in other countries, transnational actors, transnational strategic litigation organisations. And I think the reason behind that perhaps is that these actors were reading the tea leaves. They were seeing that other countries were looking at Australia, wanting to adopt Australian policies, and so they were wanting, I suspect, a conclusion, a statement from the International Criminal Court. Now, it was always, I guess, fairly ambitious and probably fairly unlikely that there would actually ever be prosecutions of Australian, Australian political actors in the International Criminal Court. But the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has made a conclusion that our offshore processing policies have resulted in cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. So violations of the Rome Statute, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And so I think that conclusion is very significant, not just for Australia, but for other countries, embarking on these types of policies. But if I want to, I know we're over time already, so just very, very quickly, I've already talked about pushbacks and non-refoulement, so that's our sort of cardinal obligation under the Refugee Convention, under the Torture Convention as well. Deprivation of liberty, obviously, with our immigration detention and our offshore processing centres. The UN Special Rapporteur has said that the conditions in our offshore processing centres and our immigration detention centres amount to torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. But also, if you look at the Refugee Convention, we speak a lot about non-refoulement, so non-return to a place of danger. The Refugee Convention outlines a number of rights that we as a host state are obligated to provide refugees, so rights to work, rights to education, which of course with our current policies, both offshore processing, immigration detention, and also our temporary protection visas, we're not honouring those obligations as well. So people are really living these lives in limbo, these suspended lives, not being able to get on with their lives. And just, one thing I'll highlight too, which is very important with the Convention of the Rights of the Child, many breaches of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. I'll just highlight one that I think is really problematic. I mean, now in any action that a state takes in relation to a child, we have to consider the child's best interest as a primary consideration. I continue to find the fact that the Minister for Immigration is refugee children's, asylum-seeking children's guardian as very problematic. The Immigration Minister who is implementing these policies that have been condemned by many Australian and international actors as gross violations of international human rights. There we go.
Thanks, Kate. Your sobering answer. Listen, I'm very conscious that we've already gone over time, but I can't resist one final question before I formally close, if you will humour me. And this I might direct to you, Andrew. You talked about potential solutions, legal pathways, etc., at the national level. I'm wondering, given that by definition displacement of people across borders is a transnational issue, what degree of transnational collaboration or regional collaboration has there been between affected countries in Latin America, for example? I think Juan Pablo referred to the Los Angeles Declaration. I think there was the development some years ago of what was called the Quito process. Drawing on your experience, what's the record been in Latin America of regional coordination or attempts to arrive at regional solutions? How effective have they been? Who have been parties to them, and what sort of commitments have been made? Andrew?
I mean, I think it's mixed, but it's a glass half full or half empty. There's always in migration a tension between a desire for sovereignty, right? For sovereign decisions that countries make because it's about who has a right to enter their borders, right? And this notion that you can't actually manage migration unless you have some sort of cooperation across borders. And so most countries are schizophrenic and most regions are somewhat schizophrenic in this, right? I mean, I think there's been some movement towards thinking cooperatively in the Western Hemisphere. We've seen this in Mercosur, now the Caribbean CARICOM, an alliance of a number of Caribbean countries, 12 Caribbean countries, is trying to have total free mobility by 2024. We don't yet know the details. They're working on that. They're exempting Haiti from that, however. But a number of countries, 11 of the 12, are trying to do that. There's quite a few things going on. The Quito process was an attempt by countries that were the major recipients of Venezuelan migrants and refugees to try and have a coordinated process and agree on some principles and some response steps. I would say it was somewhat effective, but then there were moments where countries had different interests and they went different directions. So it was a lot better than not having it. It was really an important forum and continues to be an important forum, but it was certainly not a solution to everything, and countries did assert their own, sovereign right to make decisions, sometimes without even notifying neighboring countries of changes and meetups of policies and so on. So definitely better than not having it, because it's definitely an important experience. There's also something called R4V, the response for Venezuelans, which is a coordinated platform by IOM and UNHCR, and lots of NGOs and UN agencies, which has been an incredibly important response to coordinate aid and assistance for even building legal, policies and legal responses that I think has been quite effective. And now you have the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection, which was signed by 22 countries in the end in June of last year. And it's a set of principles around supporting countries that are taking in large migrant and refugee populations, opening legal pathways and protection mechanisms, promoting humane border management, and coordinating policies when there are large flows of people. It is a great set of principles. It's actually a very readable 1.5-page document. I think it's well written. It's great. It has allowed for lots of conversations to happen that would not have. I mean, I get pulled in the middle of conversations sometimes between the Americans and the Colombians, the Mexicans and the Colombians, and the Ecuadorians and the Panamanians. And, it's very fascinating to watch. And I think there's a lot of creativity. The Spanish and the Canadians and the Americans and Mexicans talk to each other as a group too. There's lots of conversations going on in the hemisphere. I think I think there's a growing recognition you need cooperation to manage migration. And then again, that is fighting against the inertia of countries wanting to make their own decisions for either policy or quite often political reasons. But look, it's a big step forward than where we were 5 years ago, and I think that's important. If I could answer one more thing, actually, Ambassador, if you let me, the question there about the US and Australia, I just would say, I know there's been a lot of talk about Australia and asylum, but in terms of legal immigration, we always hold Australia and Canada out as two countries that have deeply intentional immigration policies. I know they're imperfect and perfectible. And the Australian system has, stresses and strains that the current government is trying to update. And there's a debate around this right now in Australia. The Canadian government's also trying to figure out their way forward. But in terms of thought out how to manage migration intentionally, I think the R models in the US has a lot to learn from both Australia and Canada. And it's great having a conversation about this. I have to say, Trump is a contradictory thing on immigration. When you look at polls in the US, what you find is most Americans are very positive on legal immigration. They recognize that immigration is important for the economy. And at the same time, they're very concerned about the border. And the other flip side of Australia and Canada is Australia and Canada are islands. Right? I mean, Canada is not literally an island, but, as I say to my Canadian friends, there's fish on three sides and us on the other. We're like a bunch of fish. So, and that means, yes, there are people who try and arrive seeking asylum or trying to arrive, in regular pathways, but much lower numbers, right, in the end. And in the US, irregular migration tends to dominate, particularly when the numbers are high and it's very visible. It tends to dominate and suck all the oxygen out of the debate on legal immigration. But I think we are actually a contradictory, a lot of immigrants and children of immigrants voted for Donald Trump. Right. And they voted for Donald Trump because they agreed that they wanted him to shut down the border, but they didn't really believe his stuff about legal immigration and that, that they sort of like, yeah, whatever. But you do see this bifurcation in American public opinion between a generally positive view. There's 20 to 25% of the population that really doesn't like immigrants. Which is a big number, by the way, actually. But it is a specific group of people. If you look at the other 75%, overwhelmingly positive and higher than ever before. Approval of legal immigration and the role of immigrants in American society. But the whole question of irregular migration and how we manage the asylum system, all that does consume the oxygen. And that's really where the tensions lie, the larger mainstream tensions. And I realize, Ambassador Campbell, I'm going beyond my remit, which is to talk about Latin America. I've resisted talking about the US for the rest of the evening, but I just thought I had to respond to that question. And yes, a lot to learn from Australia. Part of why I'm going to Australia in a couple of months is precisely that there is a huge opportunity to learn.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks for your last comment. There's an opportunity to continue the conversation, obviously, when you do come to Australia then. I'm afraid that the moment has arrived where, as coordinator, I have to close the session because our time is up. I think that the discussion has been tremendously useful in raising awareness of Australian understanding of how Latin America has dealt with many of the same issues. I think it's also given us fair warning that the trend towards politicisation of refugee and immigration policy is not only real, but it's not showing any signs of abating anytime soon. I think that, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the most obvious conclusion that we can reach is that it's an issue that's very complex as well as being very contentious. And I think that underlines all the more reason to continue the conversation and to compare and contrast our legal and regulatory approaches at the domestic level, legal pathways that we've talked about, and also the feasibility of regional or international approaches. Also, I think it's important to discuss the negative effects of politicising refugee and immigration policy. That's true, but in the same breath, to discuss the feasibility of engaging in more constructive approaches and comparing notes on some of the success stories as well. So let me conclude then by thanking all of our panellists, those who are here present and those who participated online. John Minns, Andrew Sellis, Kate Ogg, and Juan Pablo Ramaciotti. It's been tremendous to meet you all and tremendous to hear what you've had to contribute to the conversation on the topic. Let me also add my thanks to my co-moderator, Eve Lester, and to the invaluable support staff from the College of Arts and Sciences here at ANU. As I said, I think and hope this is just the beginning of a conversation. You've raised many points that clearly we haven't resolved and clearly we need to continue talking about. Thank you all very much.